A person cannot be honest in their dealings with God if they are not loyal to the things which God has given to mankind. To be loyal to those things that God has delivered to us, there must be a sincerity of heart, that we must be doing it for the right reason. And so all three of those words, honesty, loyalty, and sincerity, are intertwined with one another when it comes to serving our God. But this was something that they were missing. When you think about the scribes and the Pharisees and others in their time, it was a very dangerous situation they put themselves in, because this type of righteousness that is only to be seen of men is one that is practiced only because it gets the praise of men. In other words, if man is not going to praise me for the things I do for God, then I'm not going to do them. And it's really easy for us to set aside the things of God because men will criticize us or chastise us or make fun of us or put us into a situation where we feel pressure to not follow after the things of God. And society has always been this way. Families have always been this way. Congregations of God's people have always been this way, and have always had people who have been putting pressure on others to set aside the things of God because of something that's in the immediate, something that's necessarily going to bring praise upon themselves here and now, and not thinking about the future. And Jesus chastised them for this in places like Matthew chapter 6. You remember, even in the Sermon on the Mount, and the Sermon on the Mount is a very good exercise in learning what it means to serve God with sincerity of heart and to be loyal and honest in our dealings with God. He's already been talking about in chapter 5 all these different things that you've heard that they have said to you in their teachings. But these were not the things of God. This is what God has said, and then this is what man has said. And in chapter 6, he points out, especially in these first 18 verses, that this is especially the case when it comes to your practice of worship to God. And so when a person is praying, Jesus says, don't go out there into the streets and the synagogues to be seen, or the streets and the corners and the marketplaces to be seen. Instead, do things like this. When you do your charitable deeds, don't be like someone who sounds the trumpet before you go in. Imagine, if you will, someone going in this morning and they're going to put their money in the collection plate and they say, stop everybody and watch. Look how much I'm going to give this morning. Or watch that I'm going to give something this morning. If tradition is correct, one of the traditions tells us that the way in which they would often give their alms and things was in this deal that basically looked like a trumpet. And you could spin the coin in such a fashion to where it would make these real long circles and get smaller and smaller circles as it would go down. And it would make this resounding noise to where you would know that someone was putting money in there. Jesus also says that when you pray, don't do it openly. Don't do it before people to get their praise. But go into your closet. And as it was with your money, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Go in your closet and pray your prayers between you and your God. Your God sees these things in secret. He'll reward you openly. But don't do these things so that you may be seen. Even when it comes to the repetition of words, the vain repetition, just saying phrases over and over again. Don't think that this is the way that you get God to hear you. It's just by saying the same thing over and over, because you're only speaking to others when you do that. God knows what you need. When you fast, don't be like an unmade bed. In other words, don't let people know that you're fasting. Wash yourself off. Keep yourself clean. Don't let people know that that's what you're doing. God sees what's going on. God knows why you're fasting. God knows the purpose behind it. So don't be like that. But the scribes and the Pharisees and hypocritical righteousness is something that we're only getting praise from men for. So in Matthew 23, verses 5 through 7, Jesus continues in what was read for us this morning by saying, all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad, enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feast, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi, to be called teacher, teacher, Rabbi, Rabbi, to have people recognize them in the marketplace. When they go to a feast, someone to sit them in a position of honor and prestige. One of the things that we are blessed with here is that we don't typically have, because of just the characteristics of the congregation, we don't typically have a lot of our members in the hospital and going through illnesses, though there are some. When I was in Alabama, the congregation there had a lot of people, and it was a frequent activity to be at the hospital because of so many members who were older, who had health problems, and being at the hospital. And one thing that I noticed is that whether it was a member of the congregation I was preaching at or a member of another congregation I was just going to see while they were in the hospital, they almost always wanted the preacher to be the one who said the prayer in the room. And that is something that, though it may be something that people don't think of themselves, sometimes we as preachers may get offended if we're not asked to do such things as that. There are some preachers who may get offended by not being asked to go and hold a meeting somewhere, to be invited to do the things. And one of the things in which sometimes people will measure the worth of a preacher is, well, how many people attend the congregation where you attend? How many meetings do you hold a year? What magazines do you write for? Rather, we have to be careful because it's not something that we're talking about just with members of a congregation we have to watch out for. But as it is in truth, even those who are in leadership positions can find themselves victims and pray for such temptations as that. In John 12, verses 42, these types of things carry with them a great amount of power as well. John 12, 42 and 43, nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, speaking of Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him. The reason why is because they might be cast out of the synagogue, because they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. Then you put them both on the scale, one's going to outweigh the other. I would rather hear what it is that men have to say about me than to understand and imagine and think about what God has to say about me. That's a horrible position to put yourself in. So this is a question we have to ask ourselves, and this is what Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, the story of Ananias and Sapphira was about. Is it that I want to be praised by men, or is it that I want to be right with God? With Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, it seems that they were selling their possessions because they wanted to be seen of men and praised by men. They were willing to give up some of their wealth, some of their possessions in order to garner this praise, but they were not willing to give it all. And the problem with it is that they had the right to decide whether or not they were going to sell the land. God didn't tell them they had to do that. No one told them they had to do that. But others were doing it, and others like Barnabas, the son of encouragement, was getting praise for it. So why should they be left out? And so when they brought their proceeds, they lied about how much it was. And they lied about how much they sold it for. And they lied about how much they were giving to the Lord. And not only that, but this husband and wife team not only did this thing, but as she came in 3 hours later, and they asked her the question, it's revealed that they had conspired with one another. This was a conversation they had with each other to lie about this thing. That's how deadly, that's how dangerous wanting to be praised by men really is. And one of the other reasons is because having this mindset is something that emphasizes the teachings of men rather than the truth that comes from God. Because I have to listen to whatever it is that you believe. I have to respond to whatever it is that you feel. And it's going to emphasize those types of things rather than what it is that God has actually said about a topic. In Matthew 15, verses 1 through 9 is a very good section of Scripture that points this out. Matthew 15, verses 1 through 9, you know that the scribes and the Pharisees, again, they had a problem with Jesus and his disciples in what they were doing. They came to Jesus in Matthew 15, and we looked at this a little bit last week when they were asking the question in verse 2, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. In other words, they don't wash their hands according to the prescribed manner. And if you've ever watched shows about how doctors, physicians will wash their hands, surgeons especially, it was almost a similar technique. So they were not going to defile themselves when they went to the marketplace and touch something and then eat with these unwashed, these blemished hands. And Jesus points out their hypocrisy. You know, you're so big about washing your hands. You are thinking so much, and you want to make absolutely sure, where it seems to me in this text, they made a trip to ask Jesus about this and make an accusation about it. And they know where it came from, the tradition of the elders. The elders have said that this is what you're supposed to do. If you want to remain clean, if you want to be pure, this is how you go about doing it. And Jesus says, you know what, you're so concerned about washing your hands, but you'll let your parents go hungry and starve to death because you're not willing to take care of them. You want to lay up some money that you say is for God, but you're actually laying it up for yourself. And you make the commandment of God of no effect when he says, honor your father and your mother. You make it mean nothing because of your traditions, like Corbin and laying this money aside that God had not commanded. But you want to listen to what the elders of the land had to say about this instead of the truth of what God has to say. And brethren, it's very easy for those types of mindsets, that type of thing, to creep into the Lord's body. And we've seen it in many different endeavors. We'll set aside the truth of God when it comes to that we're all supposed to eat of the Lord's Supper. And yet we'll have those who say no because we think it needs to be done this way. And because of that, they will exclude someone from the Lord's Supper. Or because this must be about the one cup with the Lord's Supper instead of the contents of the cup, which is what Jesus emphasized. We have to be so very careful because no man has the right to set aside the commandments of God to keep some tradition that men have come up with. The truth of God is what we're going to be judged by from beginning to end. In Romans 10, verses 3 and 4, Paul points out that his own people had a zeal toward this type of thing, that they had a zeal for God, but they were seeking to establish their own righteousness, and because of that, they had set aside the righteousness of God. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. It is about believing in Jesus Christ and submitting to Him and not some ordinance of man or tradition of men. In Titus 1 and verse 14, there's a lot of teachings and a lot of fables that Paul had to deal with even in his time. So he tells Titus not to give heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men. And this is why, who turn from the truth, following after the traditions of men, even if they're good traditions. And please understand, following after traditions of men, even if they're good traditions, if that's the reason we're keeping it, it will turn us away from the truth of God. Because our faith is not in God who gave the commandment, but in men who gave the tradition, even if the tradition itself was good. Our mind and our heart is dedicated to the wrong place, the wrong purpose, and it will lose each and every time. Because this is something that only emphasizes the outward, and it neglects from beginning to end the inward part of man, where God is really worshiped from, where God is really served from, where God is really has the devotion of the individual Christian's heart. In Matthew 23 again, verses 27 and 28, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And if you go through Matthew 23, you see how many times he calls them hypocrites. Outwardly, this show, this act. The word hypocrite, you've heard many times before, comes from the theater. It's the idea of putting on a face to pretend to be a certain character, and then you take that face off and you're your real self. Jesus says this is the face that you're showing to people. You're like a tomb that's whitewashed. You're like this beautiful, ornate thing. However, inside you're full of dead men's bones and all kinds of uncleanness. And so outwardly you do appear righteous to men, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So how can it be then that a person on his outside can look so righteous, so good, so perfect, show up for every service, make comments in Bible class, know scriptures by heart? How can a person know all of these things and still be lost? This is how. Because it's only for show. It means nothing. And this is the real test. If we are not willing to do the things that Jesus has told us to do, and not just pretend to do the things that Jesus has told us to do, we are going to lose our souls. Because it's not enough to profess to know God and then not to obey Him. That's the purpose of our memory verse from Matthew 12 and verse 35, that a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, but an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. What have I treasured in my heart? And if the treasure in my heart is just to make it look like I'm serving God, just to try to prove something or show myself to be good in front of you, what am I treasuring? And it shows what I am willing to give up God for, which is the point of all of this, because it's all talk and no action. It's difficult from time to time to listen to certain brethren when they will talk to you about what should and should not be. And the reason being is because it's something that's not uniformly practiced in their lives. None of us are perfect. But when a person will major on something and then they'll miss these huge, and we'll make this point in a moment, these huge other areas of their life. It's really difficult. Really, really difficult to listen. What I have to be aware of is that if I do the same thing, if I'm all talk, but I'm no action, then teaching, preaching is ineffective. My influence in my home as a husband is ineffective. My guidance as a father is ineffective. My influence where I work is ineffective. You profess to be a Christian, but there's no actions that are behind it. Again, Matthew chapter 23, therefore whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and they do not do. I think what was read for us this morning, the phrasing was, they don't practice what they preach. What are you preaching? What are you preaching? What do other people around you know that you stand for? At least that you say you stand for. And then what do they know that you actually stand for because of what you do? That's been put to the test throughout our lives, right? And in this year, when we've talked about all the different things that have taken place this year, it's really been put to the test. And it really does reveal what we actually are serving, what we actually believe in. Because God is going to judge you by what you do. And He's going to judge you by what you do because that reveals who you are on the inside. And so we can't be all talk and no action. In Romans chapter 2, this was something that they were good at when they would say to others, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't serve idols, don't boast in the law when you are going to be someone who is a breaker of the law. So Paul begins that section by saying, you who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Don't you hear what you're saying? And don't you make the application to yourself first? Wasn't this Jesus' point in Matthew 7 when He says, don't be a hypocrite. Remove that beam from your own eye first. Then you can see clearly to remove the speck from another's eye. And this is why you're always going to miss the thing that's most important. What is the thing that's most important? I think I heard one of the kids say God. Amen. That's exactly right. God's most important. What are the weightier matters? What is the thing that's most important to you? What's the thing that's most important to me? What is the weightier matter? When I make a decision, and not something that's just a passing everyday decision, but when I make major decisions in my life, I don't think I'm different than the rest of you. Don't we sit down and weigh the pros and the cons of that decision? The good and the bad of that decision? Don't we look at the consequences of that decision, what this is going to mean in the future? And brethren, do we not and should we not also weigh, what does this decision say about me? And what does it say about my relationship with God Almighty? Because if I do not have genuine righteousness, if it is nothing more than hypocritical righteousness, because I want the praise of men, the acceptance of men, there's something in this world that I want to conform to, that I want to promote, other than the things of God, I'm always going to miss the things, and I'm always going to neglect the things that are most important. Jesus warned about this in Matthew 23, verses 23 and 24, when He said again, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Remember Matthew 15? You strain at a gnat. Jesus said, or God said in the Old Testament, don't defile yourselves. Keep yourselves clean and pure. So the tradition of the elders were, wash your hands this way. And they would strain at that gnat. Did you wash your hands this way? But they would swallow the camel. Jesus said, well, what about your parents that you're not taking care of, that God actually commanded something about? Here he says, you'll go into a person's cabinet and you'll have them bring out the different spices and say, okay, here's this spice, give 10%. Here's this spice, give 10%. Here's this spice, give 10%. But you don't worry about the justice and the mercy and the faith. In this chapter, he talks about how it is that they make havoc. They destroy widows' houses. And so they would go into a widow's house even and do these types of things and leave her possibly broke without basic necessities. But at least we got the 10% of all these things. We'll strain at a gnat and we'll swallow a camel. That's why it's so dangerous to follow after traditions of men. Because traditions of men will strain at a gnat, but will swallow the camel. Yes, you did this way, the way that everybody's used to seeing, or the way that we think it ought to be done, but you'll miss the big thing, which is the thing that God actually commanded. That's what hypocritical righteousness is all about. And that's why it makes it so dangerous. In 1 Corinthians 13, I want us to look here together. 1 Corinthians 13, as we think about what are some of these weightier matters. 1 Corinthians 13 says this, starting at verse 1, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I've become sounding brass or clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. This is what Paul says about all those situations. You can have the greatest of all the spiritual gifts, and spiritual gifts were important. Jesus promised them to men. The church at Corinth had them. Paul longed to give some of these things to the brethren in Rome. They were great and wonderful gifts that were given to the church so that the will of God might be known and confirmed among men. It was to prove that God had approved of them. But Paul says this, if you think that you having spiritual gifts makes you great, makes you wonderful, makes you secure in your salvation, you are nothing if you're not practicing those things with love. He even says this, and this is something that Christians will sometimes major on. Give everything, all your possessions. What a great and benevolent Christian it is who would be willing to sell all of his possessions and come and bring these things and give it all. And Paul says, but if you don't have love, it means nothing. Nothing. But think about all the good that it does. Think about all the benefits that others may receive from it. It means nothing because it wasn't done in love. That's why love is so important. Later in this chapter, after he talks about all these different characteristics of love, he says about the prophecies that are going to go away, the tongues that are going to fail and cease, knowledge is going to vanish away. Verse 10, that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. So when the word came, all those things would vanish. Paul says that when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known. And now abide, what are the greater things? What are the weightier matters? Now abide these three, faith, hope, love. But the greatest of these is love. And so Paul says in the midst of these two chapters where brethren were fighting and warring with each other, it seems, because of thinking that they were better than someone else. Paul says you've missed the point. You have focused on the gnat, but you've swallowed the camel. Also, we have passages like 2 Timothy 2 and verse 23, where Paul says to avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. Sometimes one of the majors that we will major on, one of the things that we'll strain at a gnat, is that we think that every argument, every dispute, every conversation, every word, everything that a person says has to be scrutinized. There are some of these things that Paul says, look, just ignore them. And the reason being is because you're going to generate strife if you start paying too much attention to them. It doesn't mean ignore false doctrine and false teaching. That's not what it means. But there's a lot of things that are just so foolish and just so ignorant that they do not justify time. And that's a harsh reality, I know. Because there's times where I may feel like there's something that's very, very important, but it doesn't even justify time. And there's some things among brethren, just to be honest with one another, there are some times that brethren will bring things up that do not justify time. Paul says, avoid these things because they generate strife. What's more important? Unity. What's more important? Unity in truth. What's more important? People understanding that there are some things that, no, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. And the reason being is because it's something that traditions of men, to get the approval of men, a passing fad or time, whatever it is, we're not going to spend time on that. And so the question I want to leave with you this morning is your righteousness nothing more than a show? It's not always easy to be completely honest and to say, you know, the only reason that I'm actually serving God is because it makes me look good. Maybe with the young people it's because my parents want me to. Maybe the reason, husbands, you're here is because your wife thinks this is important, or vice versa. But it may not necessarily be because it's with God. Let's do some self-examination and see why it is that we serve our God. And I pray to God, as I'm confident among the vast majority of us, it's because we love Him. But let us always stand guard against those things that would cause us to stray. And as our young people were studying this in their OSH lesson this morning, protect that heart. Watch over that heart. Gain that heart while they're young. And make sure they serve God because it's for God's purposes and not just our own. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, if you need to be a Christian, if you want to proclaim before this audience of people that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if you want to be baptized so that your sins will be washed away, everything is ready for that. And we would love to help you in any way that we can. As together we stand and sing this song, won't you please come?